In a lavish mansion, two newborn boys, orphaned of their mother, cried desperately in their cribs, ignored by their father and nanny. A young, black maid steps in, gathering them into her arms, warming them against her. When the father returns to find this scene, her life will be changed forever. Before we begin, tell me, what time are you listening to this and where in the world are you from? Drop a comment below and let me know. Beyond the tall, arched windows of the Hawthorne estate, snow fell in thick, silent sheets. Each flake glowed briefly in the lamplight before it was swallowed by the dark. The wind howled and clawed at the bare branches, rattling the glass like a fingernail scratching stone. Inside, the air was warm enough to soothe the skin, yet it held no comfort, only the heavy silence of a place long devoid of affection. The Hawthorne mansion, with its soaring ceilings and oil-painted ancestors, felt more like a museum than a home, every corner steeped in quiet judgment. Amara Johnson moved silently over the marble floor, the faint squeak of her sneakers the only sound breaking the stillness. She had been on her feet since dawn, polishing silver, dusting high shelves and scrubbing floors until her wrists ached. Her teal uniform, still damp from her earlier work, clung uncomfortably to her skin. She was hired for one thing: cleaning. Nothing more. But that was months ago, before the last nanny left and no replacement ever arrived. The responsibility of caring for Victor Hawthorne's twin sons had settled onto her shoulders as quietly and surely as the first winter snow. Lucas and Levi were just 3 months old, their eyes still wide and trusting, searching for a world they could believe in. Their mother had died bringing them into it, a detail the household staff spoke of in hushed whispers, as if raising their voices might awaken the dead. Their father, a man whose signature could move millions on the stock market, was a ghost Amara knew only in passing. A flash of an immaculate suit, the soft click of an office door, the low hum of phone calls that had nothing to do with his children. Tonight, the house felt particularly empty. The twins had been restless for hours. Levi was burning with a low fever, his cheeks flushed in a way that made Amara's chest tighten every time she looked at him. Lucas's cries were long, aching wails that sliced through the air like thin glass, his tiny fists clenching and unclenching in distress. She had tried everything, warming their bottles, rocking them until her back protested, humming old lullabies her own mother used to sing. Nothing lasted. The nursery was out of the question. She had checked it earlier. The air was cold and unforgiving, and the crib mattresses felt as hard as stone. She couldn't leave the boys there tonight, not with the cold creeping into their fragile bodies. In the soft glow of the living room, she found the warmest spot in front of the fireplace, where a single lamp cast an amber light onto the Persian rug. She spread a white blanket on the carpet, lowering Lucas first, then Levi, feeling their small weight leave her arms but never her heart. The constant hum of the heating system was the only sound, a noise so ingrained in the house it felt like its very bones. She knelt beside them, close enough to see the gentle rise and fall of their chests and the slight tremor of Levi's lips as he fought to stay awake. Her own muscles screamed for rest, but she kept her body between them and the draft from the far hallway. She thought about the first time she held them, how their cries instantly softened when she whispered, and how their fingers curled instinctively around hers. She thought about how no one else in this house seemed to notice them for more than a passing moment, as if they were just accessories, not living souls. A log in the fireplace shifted, sending a faint cascade of sparks up the chimney. Amara rubbed her forearm through the yellow cleaning gloves she had forgotten to take off. The skin beneath was tender where a bruise had blossomed days earlier. She swallowed the memory of how it happened, pushing it back into the dark corner of her mind where she kept all the things she couldn't change. The twins stirred again, Lucas letting out a soft whimper that tugged at her heart. She lowered herself to the carpet, resting on her side, her face level with theirs. The warmth from their small bodies mixed with the heat from the fire, enveloping her in a fragile cocoon. She tucked the edge of the blanket closer, keeping the draft at bay. Her eyelids grew heavy. The rhythm of their breathing became her own. The quiet hum of the heating system was a lullaby she never meant to hear. She told herself she wouldn't sleep, just close her eyes for a moment to ease the ache in her spine and the sharp pull in her shoulders. Outside, the wind howled and clawed at the glass. But here, in this small circle of warmth on the floor of the Hawthorne mansion, Amara held her vigil, the weight of 2 tiny lives pressing gently but undeniably against her heart. The front door opened with a soft click, and a wave of cold air crept across the marble floor like a silent tide. Victor Hawthorne stepped inside, shaking a few flakes of snow from his dark navy overcoat before removing it with a practiced motion. Beneath, his charcoal gray suit was perfectly pressed, his crimson silk tie knotted with precision, his polished leather shoes catching the dim light. He carried himself with the quiet authority of a man accustomed to rooms that stilled at his presence, his briefcase in one hand, the other closing the door behind him without a hurry. He took 2 steps into the living room and froze. The sight before him was not what he expected in his own home. Amara lay on the thick Persian carpet in front of the fireplace, her head inches from Lucas and Levi, both of whom were wrapped in the white blanket she had spread. Her yellow cleaning gloves still clung to her hands, one palm brushing protectively against the blanket's fringe as if guarding them from some unseen threat. The amber lamp softened the sharp lines of her face, but it couldn't hide the faint purple shadow blooming high on her cheekbone. Victor's eyes lingered there a fraction too long before moving back to the children. What exactly is going on here? His voice, deep and even, held a sharpness that sliced through the quiet. Amara startled, her dark eyes wide as she pushed herself into a sitting position, careful not to disturb the babies. "They've been crying for hours," she said quickly, her voice trembling with the effort to keep it steady. "One of them has a fever. I couldn't put them in the nursery. It's too cold and the mattresses are too hard. I had to keep them warm." Victor's gaze swept over her, then back to the twins who slept unaware of the tension. "You're not their nanny," he said, his tone clipped. "Why are you sleeping here?" Amara straightened her back as if bracing for a blow. "Because they needed me," she replied quietly. "And there was no one else." His eyes returned to the mark on her face. Up close, it was unmistakable. A bruise, fading but still visible. "What happened to your cheek?" The question came out flatter than he intended, but there was a new weight behind it. Amara hesitated, glancing down at Lucas's small, relaxed hand. "It was during the party last week," she said finally. "One of your guests. I was carrying a tray and he said I was in the way. He shoved me. I fell. No one stopped him." Victor felt a shift inside him, a small crack in the detached composure he had worn for years. He remembered that night. The champagne, the hum of laughter, the kind of empty conversation that fills grand rooms without saying anything at all. He had been upstairs on a call that felt important at the time. He hadn't noticed anything wrong. Or maybe he thought bitterly he hadn't looked. "And no one helped you?" he asked, though the answer was already clear. "No," she said simply, her eyes meeting his. There was no accusation in her tone, only a weary acceptance that somehow felt heavier than anger. Victor's gaze shifted back to the twins, their tiny bodies curled together in sleep. The blanket rose and fell with each gentle breath, the fire casting a flickering light across their faces. For the first time in longer than he could remember, he saw them not as an obligation to be delegated, but as something infinitely fragile, something that could be broken in ways money could never fix. The silence that followed was thick, holding more than words ever could. Outside, the wind pushed harder against the glass and the snow swirled faster. Inside, the heat pressed against his skin, but it did nothing to ease the chill curling in his chest. Victor stepped back from the living room with slow, measured movements, his gaze lingering on the sleeping twins before he turned toward the hallway. His polished shoes clicked softly on the marble as he walked, the sound echoing up to the high ceilings. Without a word, he gestured for Amara to follow. She hesitated, glancing once at the boys before rising carefully to her feet. Her yellow gloves still clung to her hands as she followed him down the hall. The air grew warmer as they approached his office, carrying the faint scent of oak and aged leather. He opened the heavy wooden door and stepped inside, letting it close behind her with a solid, deliberate click. The office was paneled in dark wood, each plank polished to a deep sheen that caught the flicker of the fire in the stone hearth. Shelves lined with thick books rose to the ceiling, their spines worn but arranged with meticulous precision. A large desk dominated the room, its surface bare except for a leather blotter, a silver pen stand and a single photograph turned face down. Victor moved behind the desk, setting his briefcase down with a controlled thud. He remained standing, his hands resting on the polished surface as his eyes fixed on her. "Explain," he said, his voice low and firm, leaving no room for evasion. Amara stayed near the door for a moment before stepping forward, the firelight catching the faint sheen of fatigue in her eyes. "The nannies have been gone for weeks," she began, her voice steady but carrying an undercurrent of exhaustion. "The last one left before the new year. No one replaced her. Since then I've been doing both jobs, cleaning the house and caring for the children." Victor's brow furrowed slightly, but he didn't interrupt. His gaze remained on her, his posture rigid as if bracing for something he didn't want to hear. Amara's hands flexed inside her gloves, the faint sound of the thin latex sharp in the stillness. "Every morning I start before sunrise, scrubbing, polishing, making sure every corner is as spotless as you expect. And in between I feed them, change them and hold them when they cry. There's no one else to do it. They're too small to be left alone." Victor leaned back slightly, his eyes narrowing in thought. "You could have said something. You could have asked for help." Amara let out a quiet, humorless breath. "To who? The other staff barely speak to me unless it's about work. And you?" She stopped, then met his gaze directly. "You're never here long enough to see them, let alone me." He said nothing, the faint crackle of the fire filling the silence. Shadows moved across his face, deepening the lines near his mouth. "You don't see them like I do," she continued, her voice softening, but with a conviction that held the weight of truth. "You don't see how they search for a face when they hear footsteps. How their fists curl around my finger like they're afraid to let go. Every time they do that, I know I can't walk away from them. I know they have no one else." Victor's gaze shifted toward the fire, the orange light reflected in his eyes. His mind went back to the last time he held them. A blur of white blankets and hospital antiseptic, the voice of a nurse telling him his wife was gone. He had told himself that distance was safer, that his absence would hurt less than his presence could ever heal. Now hearing Amara's words, that reasoning felt like paper in the rain. He looked back at her, his voice still controlled but quieter. "And the bruise? You're telling me that was one of my guests?" "Yes," she said, her tone stripped of anything but fact. "He shoved me because I was in his way. I fell hard against the wall. No one stopped him. No one even asked if I was all right." The words hung between them like a challenge he couldn't deflect. For the first time in the conversation, Victor's hands left the desk. He stepped to the side, running a palm across the back of the leather chair before lowering himself into it. His shoulders sloped forward slightly, his posture no longer the rigid steel of a businessman in control. "I didn't know," he said after a long pause, the admission almost foreign on his tongue. "Would it have made a difference?" she asked. There was no accusation, only an exhausted sincerity. His lips pressed together, the truth catching somewhere behind his teeth. He had no answer that would not condemn him. Amara stepped closer to the desk, the firelight catching the sheen of her gloves. "They don't need a last name, Mr. Hawthorne," she said, her voice clear but low, the weight of each word deliberate. "They need a father." The sentence landed between them with a force that neither the fire nor the thick walls could soften. Victor felt it settle in his chest, heavy and immovable, demanding acknowledgement. He had spent months, perhaps years, thinking of his children as a responsibility to be managed, an extension of the estate he ran with precision. Now, in the warm flicker of the fire, with the echo of her words in the room, he saw the truth with uncomfortable clarity. He had been present in name only. The crackle of burning wood was the only sound for several long seconds. Victor leaned back in his chair, his gaze fixed on the flames, but his thoughts were far away, on the boys sleeping in the other room, on the woman who had stepped into a role no one asked her to fill, on the man he had allowed himself to become. He didn't respond immediately, and Amara didn't press him. The silence was its own kind of reckoning, and both of them knew it. Victor remained seated for a moment, his gaze fixed on the fire as if it might offer an answer. The orange glow traced the edges of his face, deepening the lines near his mouth and shadowing his eyes. Then, without speaking, he pushed himself slowly to his feet. The leather of his chair sighed as he stepped away from it, his polished shoes muted by the thick rug beneath them. Amara stayed where she was, watching as he moved toward the door, his expression unreadable. He opened it and disappeared into the dim hallway without a word. She listened to his footsteps receding, the creak of a stair, the faint opening and closing of another door upstairs. The silence that followed stretched, broken only by the soft hiss of the fire and the hum of the heating system. When Victor returned, he was carrying 2 small blue blankets, folded neatly over his arm, the ones that usually sat untouched in the nursery. He stepped past her without comment, his eyes moving to the living room where the twins still lay curled together in the warm circle of light. His stride slowed as he approached them, setting the blankets on the arm of a nearby chair. He lowered himself to his knees beside them, the movement deliberate, almost hesitant, as if he were stepping into foreign territory. He reached out, his fingertips brushing against Lucas's fine, downy hair. The texture startled him, not because it was strange but because it was softer than anything he had touched in months. His hand hovered there a moment before he let it rest gently against the curve of his son's small head. In that touch came a rush of memory. The hospital room, white and sterile, the harsh light overhead, and his wife's hand slackening in his own. He remembered the doctor's voice, clinical and unyielding when delivering the news. And now, kneeling here, the same cold fear slid through him. The fear of loss, the fear that if he let himself get too close, the world would find a way to take them too. He realized with an ache that he had built his distance as a kind of armor, but all it had done was leave his sons alone. "They're smaller than I remember," he said quietly, almost to himself, his eyes still on the twins. Amara, who had stepped closer without making a sound, stood on the other side of the boys, her gaze moving between Victor's hand and the children's faces. "They need you," she said, her voice low but steady. "Not your signature on a check, not the schedule you keep taped to your office wall. They need you, not the hours you can spare them." Her words weren't sharp, but they carried the weight of truth, and he felt them settle somewhere deeper than he cared to admit. He looked up at her, his eyes meeting hers across the small space between them. The firelight caught the dark of her pupils, and he saw not just defiance, but exhaustion and a fierce loyalty that was rare in a house like his. He glanced back down at the twins, then reached for the blankets. One by one, he draped them gently over each boy, tucking the edges around their tiny bodies as he imagined their mother might have done. His movements were careful, deliberate, as if the smallest wrong gesture might undo everything. When he rose to his feet, he stood facing Amara fully. "From now on," he said, his tone steady but different from the coldness it had carried earlier, "things will change. You will not scrub another floor in this house unless you choose to. You will be their caregiver, officially, and you will be paid accordingly." His gaze sharpened slightly, but the edge was not for her. "And the man who put his hands on you will never set foot in this house again. Not as my guest. Not ever." For a moment neither spoke. The fire cracked softly behind them. The wind outside rattled against the windows, and between them hung something unspoken, an acknowledgement of what had just shifted and of what might yet be possible. The days that followed moved with a new rhythm, one that felt strange at first, like a house learning how to breathe again. The mornings no longer began in silence, broken only by the hum of the heating system. Instead, the smell of coffee drifted from the kitchen into the dining room, where Victor sat at the head of the long oak table, a twin in each arm, his suit jacket draped over the back of his chair. He read aloud from a worn children's book, his voice softer than Amara had ever heard, pausing to turn the pages slowly so small hands could swat at the colorful illustrations. Lucas cooed at the sound of his father's voice, and Levi would sometimes fall asleep halfway through a story, his head resting on Victor's chest. Amara moved through the mornings with less weight on her shoulders. The endless tension that had kept her back stiff and her jaw tight had dissolved into something almost unfamiliar: ease. She still cleaned, still cooked, but the hours were punctuated by shared laughter and the sense that the children were no longer hers to protect alone. Her smile came without effort now, rising naturally when Victor knelt beside the playmat to roll a soft ball toward the boys, or when he lingered at the breakfast table just to watch them eat. One gray afternoon, the rain came in steady sheets, tapping against the tall windows and pooling on the stone terrace outside. The sky had been low and heavy all day, the air inside carrying that faint metallic scent of wet earth. Amara sat on the deep green sofa in the living room, one twin nestled in each arm, their tiny bodies warm against her. A soft blanket covered their legs, and the rhythmic patter of rain had lulled them into a quiet, drowsy calm. The fireplace crackled in the background, its light catching the curve of her cheek as she adjusted the blanket over them. The sound of the front door opening drew her attention, and a moment later Victor appeared in the doorway, his hair damp from the rain, his tie loosened, his suit jacket hanging from one shoulder. He paused there, his gaze settling on the three of them, and a smile, small but genuine, touched his face. "Room for one more?" he asked. His voice held none of the distance it once carried. Instead, there was something tentative yet warm, like a man asking to step into a place he was only just realizing he belonged. Amara shifted slightly, making space beside her, and Victor crossed the room in a few unhurried steps. He set his jacket over the arm of the sofa and lowered himself onto the cushions, his presence settling into the space as naturally as the firelight spilling across the rug. Without hesitation, he reached for the boys, and Amara let him take them both, watching as he drew them into his lap, his arms wrapping around them with a care that seemed instinctive now. They fit against him easily, their small heads resting against his chest, their breaths syncing with his in quiet harmony. Amara leaned back, the tension in her spine dissolving completely, and for the first time in many months, she let herself breathe without reserve. The rain outside was steady, but in the room it felt far away, softened by the sound of the fire and the steady rhythm of the children's breathing. That night none of them spoke of it, but when the hour grew late they stayed where they were. The fire had burned low, its glow deep and steady, casting slow-moving shadows across the walls. The wind outside no longer sounded sharp or lonely, it was simply part of the night's music. Eventually they moved to the den where the warmth of the smaller fireplace gathered around them. Victor lay on the large couch, the twins curled against his chest, and Amara settled close beside them, her hand resting lightly over the blanket that covered them all. Sleep came gradually without resistance, the kind of sleep that trusts the night to hold what matters most. The Hawthorne mansion, once a monument to silence and separation, now held something else entirely. A warmth that was not from the heating vents or the fire, but from the quiet certainty of being present for one another. Family, Amara thought as her eyes closed, was not in the name on a birth certificate, nor in the weight of a bank account. It was in the arms that kept you safe when the world was cold, in the voice that stayed when it could have walked away, and in the choice made over and over to show up when it mattered most. To keep sharing meaningful stories, hit the like and subscribe buttons. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell to start your day with profound lessons and heartfelt empathy.